Hello, I'm Julia, and in this video I'm going to tell you a little bit about my string quartet number 5. Around the time that I wrote this, I'd been listening to Beethoven piano sonatas a lot, so there is certainly an influence of Beethoven in this one. I was interested in Beethoven's use of tonality, of how he uses the harmony and changes of direction that you wouldn't necessarily expect to go to different places to build up the tension and as part of the journey, part of the storytelling. So I wanted to explore those sort of ideas in this quartet. And like my quartet number 4, this one is in sonata form overall, but inspired by Beethoven. I haven't necessarily followed the conventions in terms of tonality. I wanted to experiment a little bit. So this started life really as a simple 8-bar sequence of chords, just played on the piano, 4 notes per chord, and I distributed them between the string quartet parts and played around with the rhythms a little bit, and that basically forms the opening theme. The rhythms in each part are slightly different. It's interesting how by varying the movement within each part, sometimes you can bring out one note within the chord over another, and I quite like playing around with that effect. And after 8 bars, this descending figure starts to appear, and that works its way around through the different parts. So these two ideas together get played with for the next 40 bars or so. This is basically the first subject, the A section. And I'm still basically working with this idea of 8-bar repeating blocks, but now with 2 ideas to play with rather than 1. So in the last couple of blocks, the descending figure basically wins out. It takes over, and the tonality shifts to take us into our second subject, or our B section. But rather than going into the dominant or the relative minor, as you might expect, I've gone somewhere slightly different. And again, inspired by Beethoven, all I've done this time is go up a semitone from D major for our first subject into E flat major for our second subject, which you might recognise as something Beethoven did a fair bit. I was thinking particularly of the opening of the Appassionata Sonata. So for our second subject, we have these 2 motifs playing off against each other in the first violin and the cello. And this lasts for about 16 bars or so before elements of the first subject start to reappear, and we move into a linking passage, which will take us back to the opening, take us back to a repeat of the whole exposition. Except I wanted to play around with this slightly. So rather than going back to a direct repeat, which was how I initially wrote it, I've actually changed it very slightly. It is a straight repeat. Everything happens as it did the first time, but rather than going back down to D major, I've shifted up another semitone to E major. And I quite like this idea of shifting up a semitone each time. I think it's a more subtle way of building up the tension. When you're initially listening to it, you may not necessarily recognise quite what's happened with the tonality, but you know something is different. It sounds different, it sounds brighter because it's E major rather than D major. So, as I say, it's a straight repeat. So after the first subject in E major, we then move up another semitone to have the second subject in F major. And sure enough, at the end of that, we should move up another semitone into F sharp major. But what I actually did instead was move into F sharp minor. And this is the start of our development. So in the development, I've played around with themes from both the first and second subjects, as you would expect, and also introduced a little bit of new material as well. But we're basically rooted in F sharp minor at this point. And towards what sounds like it might be aiming towards a recapitulation, we start to move towards what should be the relative major, A major. But again, rather than doing that, I've actually moved into the minor. So we get what sounds like a recapitulation, but in A minor instead. So it's obviously not a complete recapitulation because it's not back in our home key, it's not back to D major, but it's the same sort of material. And I like this idea of playing around with a slight ambiguity between the major and the minor, which is what we get here. And again, this was something that Beethoven did a fair bit, so I'm sure there was an influence of that here as well. So we've got a recapitulation that starts in A minor with a bit of A major thrown in, which is not really where we want to be. It's not back in our home key of D major, but I decided to go with it. Rather than going up a semitone for the B section, this time I've gone up a whole tone. So we end up, well, not in B major, but actually in B minor for the second subject. But again, there's still a little bit of this ambiguity between major and minor. But B minor is a good place for us to be. It's the relative minor of our home key. So that is getting us closer. And sure enough, we get into a linking passage which ends on a very emphatic, very extended A major dominant chord, which is another trick that I borrowed from Beethoven, making it very clear this time we really are going back to our home key. So we finally resolve into D major, where we get what sounds like another recapitulation, although at this point I think we're probably into a coda. And a bit like the coda of my quartet number 4, here the notes become shorter and basically get broken down into the original chord sequence that we started off with. So we're back to the absolute building blocks again. And it's not particularly a triumphant statement, it's not a dying away, it's not anything like that. It's just a simple statement that this basically is what gave rise to everything that we've heard before. And look how simple it was, just these chords. And I quite like that as a concept.